All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into a pretty crucial, well, it's a topic that's been getting a lot of attention, and rightfully so. We're talking about those persistent differences we see in science, when it comes to, well, who's actually achieving, who's participating.
Yeah, it's a big one, and it's well documented. And while these patterns exist across different scientific fields, we're going to mainly focus on physics today because, well, the data consistently shows, it really highlights the biggest divides in both achievement and participation in physics specifically. But it is important to note that, similar trends, although sometimes less pronounced, do pop up in other fields too, like chemistry.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So our mission, really, on this deep dive is to dig into the research and try to understand these gender differences in science through a specific lens. We're looking at it through how expertise develops in science. Basically, we're trying to give you a shortcut, like the Cliff Notes version of a really complex topic, to help you understand what's going on.
And it's really important to say right off the bat, this isn't about inherent ability. The research really points to a much more intricate set of factors at play here.
So let's start with the underrepresentation problem. What does that actually look like numerically? What are we talking about here?
Well, let's break it down, with some stats. Looking at the numbers, it's pretty stark, the picture they paint. Back in 2004, the NSF, the National Science Foundation, a key government agency that tracks, all the science trends, looked at the percentage of master's and doctoral degrees awarded to women in a bunch of STEM fields. So in computer science, it was like around 34% for masters and 19% for doctorates. Chemistry showed a little bit better representation at 41% for masters and 32% for doctoral degrees. But when you zoom in on physics and engineering, that's where the numbers take a nosedive, really. Physics and engineering master's degrees, only about 21% went to women. And at the doctoral level, it was even more dismal, just 13% in physics and 17% in engineering. So, the point here isn't just, oh, there's a gap. It's that physics and engineering are just lagging behind other STEM fields like chemistry, even computer science, at those, the highest academic levels. And that's a key part of this puzzle we're trying to, figure out.
Yeah. And what's, I think, super fascinating here is how early these differences pop up. There's all this research on standardized tests, things like the NEEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it's going back to 2005, and even earlier studies. They show that you can see gender differences in science achievement, like as early as fourth grade. And what's particularly concerning, I guess, is that this achievement gap tend to widen as students, progress through school, especially in the physical sciences and, like you said, specifically in physics.
Yeah, and that's the trend that's super important to understand. Why does this gap keep widening? Why are we losing so many talented girls along the way?
Right. But here's the really intriguing contrast, right? When you look at classroom grades, in K-12, like elementary, middle school, it's almost flipped the pattern, or at least really different. Boys tend to actually get lower grades than girls in all subjects, even science, in those early years. And then by high school, the research, this is, stuff from the late 90s, it shows that the grades in science, even in physics, kind of become more similar between genders. So you have this weird contrast between how they're performing in the classroom versus these standardized tests. What does the research say about why that might be?
Well, that's one of the big questions, isn't it? You see this early divergence on standardized tests, but then girls are often doing as well or even better in the classroom. And the inconsistency continues into college. Some studies suggest that female undergrads, they actually do just as well as their male peers in science courses, while other studies, especially in physics and engineering, show that the guys are outperforming the women, even when you look at, both science and non-science majors. So there's this back and forth, right? This inconsistency in the findings depending on what you're measuring and how you're measuring it.
Yeah, and it's not just grades either. You've got a ton of research showing that women are more likely to switch out of physics majors into non-science fields compared to men. And this happens even after accounting for things like their first-year grades. Yeah. So you've got these women who initially show, interest and ability, but they're still leaving physics at a much higher rate than men. What's going on there? Even with the initial aptitude and putting in the work, something's pushing them away. It suggests there's something more than just academics at play.
Exactly. And studies that like compare those who switch out of physics with those who stay in, they often find that these women report similar GPAs, even comparable time spent on their science coursework. So it's not simply about, oh, they're not cutting it academically. And as the source material points out, this really begs the question, why is there this disconnect between, classroom success in those earlier years and performance on tests, and then, the lower grades for females in college science in some cases? What's the missing link there?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I mean, some of the suggested explanations for these discrepancies, they're interesting. But the research is, well, there's not a lot of it. Like with the higher classroom grades for girls in K-12, some theories point to like girls being more focused on, pleasing the teacher or having fewer disciplinary issues. Basically, are we maybe measuring compliance more than actual understanding sometimes? I mean, it's an interesting point, especially when you see those same students, not doing as well on those standardized tests. It makes you think.
It does. It does. And then, when we look at the potential reasons for like female underperformance kind of more broadly, the literature mentions things like, oh, there are differences in teacher support, parental support, motivation levels, enrollment patterns in science courses, and even the amount of hands-on experience that students are getting. But as this research highlights, there really isn't like a unified theory, like a single, framework that ties all this together.
Right. So that brings us to this idea of like looking at it through the lens of expertise. Like, how does expertise develop, and are there differences in that process based on gender? So, okay, first things first, what exactly do we even mean by expertise in this context?
So when we talk about expertise, we're talking about that set of characteristics, that collection of, skills, knowledge, and even attitudes that really sets apart the experts from the novices in any field. And it's more than just, knowing a lot of facts. It's about things like having more goal-directed strategies for problem solving, having, a greater amount of knowledge, and that knowledge being more organized, having higher levels of motivation, a tendency to engage in like really deliberate practice, often having more social support, and even just being better at like monitoring their own performance, knowing how they're doing and how to adjust. It's a whole package, right?
So it's not just like, oh, you know more stuff.
No, not at all. While a strong knowledge base is like definitely important, expertise is also about how that knowledge is structured and how it's used, right? Like how you apply it in real world situations. And what's really fascinating is that expertise also has these like domain specific aspects, right? What makes an expert in physics might not be the same as what makes an expert in, say, biology.
Okay, so like what's an example of that? Like how does expertise manifest differently in, say, physics versus biology?
Sure. So for example, in physics, experts they lean on using pictorial representations like diagrams and sketches when they're solving problems. Whereas in biology, that might not be as much of a defining characteristic between, your expert and your novice. Similarly, an expert in computer science might be really good at, dealing with those unexpected outputs in their code, troubleshooting, debugging, whereas a novice might just get totally stumped. So it's really about the specific skills and knowledge that are most valued and most effective in that particular domain.
That makes sense. So how long does it typically take, like on average, to reach this level of expertise?
Well, research suggests it's not a quick fix. It's definitely a long game. We're talking like typically in the range of 5 to 10 years of dedicated effort, like really putting in the time. And like we said, not just any time, but really focused, intentional effort. And in the context of physics research, when they were looking at this, they often define novices as like high school students or, those introductory college physics courses, whereas the experts are usually your seasoned physicists, your physics professors, your doctoral students. So there's a pretty clear distinction there in terms of experience and the level of mastery they've attained.
Yeah, it's not just about, like you said, putting in the time, but it's about how you're spending that time.
Right. Exactly. It's not just clocking in the hours, it's about how you're using those hours. And expertise, it's this outcome of both experience and personality. Deliberate practice is huge, and by that we mean that focused, intentional work that's really aimed at improvement. Like you're not just going through the motions, you're actively trying to get better, identifying your weaknesses and working on them. But it's also super important to remember that those social and personal contexts, like your family background, societal influences, they play a role, a big role, in whether or not expertise can even emerge in the first place. So it's this interplay of individual effort and the environment you're in.
Right, and that makes sense. So how has expertise, traditionally been studied in physics,
Yeah.
and where does the gender difference research fit in? Or I guess more accurately, where does it not fit in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, traditionally, when researchers have looked at expertise in physics, they've been really focused on problem-solving skills and, how much knowledge someone has and how that knowledge is organized. They haven't always, paid as much attention to those broader social and personal contexts that we're just talking about. And then on the flip side, the research on gender differences in science, that's often highlighted these social and personal factors, but it hasn't always delved as deeply into those nitty-gritty differences in problem-solving skills and knowledge. So it's almost like these two lines of research have kind of been running in parallel, not really intersecting as much as they probably should.
That's a really important point. So this paper that we're talking about, it's proposing this expertise framework to try to like bridge that gap, right? Like what does that look like? Can you break it down for us?
Absolutely. So this proposed framework, it brings together, a bunch of key aspects of expertise. You've got problem-solving strategies, like how do experts and novices actually approach problems differently? There's the use of pictorial representation, like how are individuals visualizing these problems? Problem categorization, how deeply and conceptually is someone understanding a problem to classify it? Then there's metacognitive skills, which is, that ability to think about your own thinking, basically. It's like having a coach in your head while you're working through a problem. You're not just doing it, you're thinking about how you're doing it. Is it working? Do I need to change something? And then crucially, it also includes those social supports, motivation, and deliberate practice as really, really essential components of the whole process.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack there. But you mentioned earlier that there's some limitations to, applying this framework to gender differences right now.
Yeah.
What are those limitations?
Well, the biggest one, the most significant limitation, is that we just don't have enough research that specifically looks at gender differences within each of these expertise variables. Like a lot of the expertise research that's been done in physics, it just hasn't included a gender analysis. And then a lot of the gender difference research, it hasn't really focused on these specific skills and knowledge areas that the expertise research has identified as being important. And, on top of that, our understanding of how physics experts actually function in like real world settings in those complex, messy situations that they face in their work, that's still pretty limited.
Right, so it's like we're trying to force a square peg in a round hole a little bit, at least with the existing research. But let's see what we can glean by looking at these like expertise components one by one, through a gender lens. So let's start with problem-solving strategies. How do novices and experts like approach physics problems differently? What are the key differences there?
Well, the main difference lies in their overall approach, like their strategy. Novices tend to use what we call a working backward strategy. So they'll usually start with the equation that, contains the unknown, the thing they're trying to find, and then they'll kind of work backward from there, finding other equations to solve for the intermediate unknowns. It's very data driven, they're kind of letting the equations lead the way. Experts, on the other hand, they usually go for what we call a working forward strategy. So they'll start with the information that's given in the problem. They'll apply, the relevant physics principles and laws, and then work forward to get to the solution. It's much more understanding based.
Yeah.
It's about, having that deep conceptual grasp of the physics and using that to guide your steps.
And this is something that the research actually backs up, right?
Right. Oh, yeah, yeah. There have been a number of studies that have shown that experts predominantly use this working forward strategy, while novices are more likely to fall back on that working backward approach. It's not like 100%, black and white though. There's also research that shows that, novices can be taught to use the working forward strategy, especially if they've got like really good conceptual instruction beforehand, and even experts, they might switch to working backward if they come across a problem that's particularly difficult or something they've never seen before. It's kind of like, you've got your preferred method, but you're adaptable. You can switch it up if the situation calls for it.
So that's the difference in how they solve problems. But what about gender differences in these specific strategies? Is there any research on that?
This is where we hit, another one of those research gaps. We don't really have like direct research that specifically compares, male and female students using working forward versus working backward in physics. But if we zoom out a little bit and look at like Broader science strategy research, which, often relies on self-reports from students, the findings, they're all over the place. Some studies will say, oh, females use more rote memorization strategies in science. Others say the opposite, and some say there's no difference. So it's a bit messy.
So we don't really have a clear picture yet. But I mean, if we play devil's advocate here for a second and say, okay, let's assume that, females are relying more on memorization, how might that connect to those problem-solving strategies we were just talking about?
Oh, that's a really good point. If you're learning by just memorizing facts and formulas, without really understanding the deeper concepts, you're more likely to approach a problem by just trying to plug in those formulas that you've memorized, right? It's that working backward strategy, basically. And this reliance on memorization, it could also, potentially explain that discrepancy we saw before between classroom grades where, sometimes just remembering the right answer can get you a good grade versus standardized tests or college level physics where you really need to understand the concepts and be able to apply them in new situations.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's move on to the next expertise component, problem representation. Specifically the use of visuals. Like what's the deal there between experts and novices? How do they use visuals differently?
So experts in physics, they're really big on using pictures, using diagrams, sketches to represent the key variables and relationships in a problem before they even start messing with the equations. It's like they're creating a visual roadmap of the problem first. Novices, though, they tend to jump straight to the math, straight to the equations, without really taking the time to visualize what's going on.
Okay.
And this visualization piece, it's really helpful because it allows you to really understand the problem, to identify the relevant forces and energies that are involved, and it helps you organize the information in a way that makes sense.
That makes sense. So are there any gender differences in this visual aspect?
Well, so there's not direct research showing that, oh, males are more likely to draw pictures when they're solving physics problems or anything like that. But there is a huge amount of research that consistently shows that males, and this is across different ages, they tend to do better on tests of spatial ability, things like 3D visualization, mental rotation, that kind of stuff. And interestingly, spatial ability has actually been linked to achievement in physics.
Hmm. Interesting. So could it be that this male advantage in physics is at least partly tied to this difference in spatial skills?
It's definitely a strong possibility. I mean, physics it's very visual, very spatial, right? You're often having to interpret visual and spatial relationships to understand what's going on. So it's plausible that males with their potentially stronger spatial abilities might be using more visualizations and maybe even more complex, more accurate visualizations when they're tackling physics problems. And that could definitely give them a leg up in terms of understanding and ultimately, succeeding in solving those problems.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's move on to conceptual understanding and how experts categorize problems. So how do experts do it differently than novices? What are we talking about here?
Well, expert problem solvers, that they just have this much deeper, more organized understanding of the underlying physics concepts. And this really comes out in how they categorize problems. So when an expert looks at, say, two different physics problems, they'll see them as similar if the same fundamental physics principle or law can be applied to solve them, right? It's about seeing the underlying structure, the connecting threads between seemingly different situations. Novices, on the other hand, they tend to categorize problems based on what's on the surface, on those superficial features. Like they might group problems based on the objects that are involved, like a ladder versus a car, or the specific terms that are mentioned, like friction versus gravity. They're not necessarily seeing the deeper connections based on the underlying physics principles.
So it's about seeing the forest for the trees, basically.
Yeah, exactly. As a classic study showed this really clearly. They had experts and novices sort physics problems into groups, and the experts, they grouped them based on principles like conservation of energy, really deep stuff.
Yeah.
But the novices, they grouped them based on oh, there's an inclined plane in this one, there's a pulley in that one, very surface level. And if we circle back to that idea of, females maybe relying more on memorization, which, we need more research on, but that's the case.
Then their knowledge organization might be more surface level too, leading to those novice-like categorizations.
Right, exactly. If you're focusing on memorizing facts and formulas without really digging into the concepts, you're more likely to categorize based on those superficial details. And that would suggest a weaker conceptual understanding, which could definitely contribute to lower scores on those physics achievement tests that are designed to really probe that deeper understanding. It's you can memorize all the parts of a car, but if you don't understand how the engine works, you're not going to be able to diagnose a problem and fix it, right?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Okay, so next up we have metacognition. That's basically like thinking about your own thinking, right? How does that play into expertise, especially in a field like physics?
Right. Metacognition, it's being aware of your own thought processes, your strategies, and how well they're working. And it's considered super crucial for effective problem solving, and especially for making that transition from, being a novice to being an expert. It involves being able to, select the right strategy for a problem, monitor how well it's working as you're going, and then, being able to adapt to switch to a different strategy if you need to. Experts are generally much better at this than novices, who might just keep using the same strategy even if it's not working. It's like they're not really aware of what they're doing or why. They're just kind of going through the motions.
So metacognition is kind of like being your own coach, watching yourself on the sidelines and giving yourself feedback.
Exactly. And research has actually shown that having strong metacognitive skills can even compensate for having maybe lower general problem solving ability. So it can actually make up for other weaknesses in some cases. And it's especially important for those problems that require a really deep conceptual understanding where you can't just rely on rote memorization. You actually have to think through the problem and understand how the concepts apply. And some studies have even shown that directly teaching metacognitive skills can lead to improvements in students' conceptual understanding in physics. So it's not just something that, some people are born with. It's something you can actually teach and learn.
That's really encouraging to hear. But again, the question is, what about gender differences in metacognition in science? Like, do we know anything about that?
That's the frustrating part. There's a real lack of research in this area, surprisingly. We don't really know if there are any significant gender differences in metacognitive skills when it comes to science, or how those skills might be affecting things like, problem categorization or strategy use. It seems logical that good metacognitive skills would be linked to, using that working forward strategy and being able to categorize problems more like an expert, but nobody's really studied that in depth. It makes you wonder, could potentially poor metacognition in some females be contributing to their lower performance in physics? It's a missing piece of the puzzle for sure.
Definitely something to explore further.
Oh.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about support, specifically support from teachers and parents. How did that factor into the development of expertise generally? Like, what does the research say about that?
Well, there isn't a ton of specific research on social support and how it relates to physics expertise specifically. But the broader expertise literature, it definitely emphasizes how important that support is. Think about it. If you're trying to become an expert in something, you're going to need guidance. You're going to need feedback. You're going to need encouragement. And that often comes from, parents and instructors throughout different phases of your development. They're the ones who can help you stay motivated, who can provide you with opportunities to learn and grow, who can help you see your own potential even when you maybe don't see it yourself.
And we know that there are definitely documented gender differences in how teachers interact with male and female students in science classrooms,
Yeah.
particularly in those, K-12 years.
Oh, absolutely. There's tons of research on this. It shows, pretty consistently that in elementary, middle school, high school science classrooms, boys tend to get more attention from teachers. They're called on more often. They kind of dominate those classroom interactions, and they tend to get asked more of those higher level academically related questions. And there's even some evidence to suggest that science teachers might subconsciously have lower expectations for girls' intellectual abilities in science, even though, girls are often just as engaged, if not more so, and they initiate interactions just as much as boys. So there's definitely some unconscious bias happening there, which can have a big impact on girls' confidence and their willingness to participate.
Yeah. It's like even if it's not intentional, those lower expectations, they can get communicated to the students, and then that can affect their engagement and their belief in themselves. And it's not just at the K-12 level, right?
Right.
What about college?
Yeah, so the research on teacher support at the college level is a bit more mixed. Some studies have found that, females in physics and engineering might actually get less feedback and support from their instructors, but there's also research that, hasn't found any significant differences in how male and female undergrads are treated by science faculty. So it's a little bit more complicated at that level, but I think the key takeaway is that females might actually need more support and guidance, especially in a field like physics, which can be pretty, intimidating and challenging. And unfortunately, that support isn't always there, especially in those big introductory college science courses where it can be really easy to feel lost in the crowd.
Yeah, and it's not just teachers, right?
Yeah.
Like parental beliefs and interactions around science. Those seem to be different depending on the gender of the child, too.
Absolutely. So research has shown that, parents often hold this belief that science is just less interesting and more difficult for their daughters compared to their sons. And this belief can actually shape how they interact with their kids about science, what kinds of activities they encourage, what kind of language they use. For example, there have been studies where they've observed mothers using more science-related language with their sons at a younger age. And even parents in like science museums, they tend to, provide more of those scientific explanations to their sons compared to their daughters. And even fathers, they've been shown to use more scientific vocabulary, especially related to physics, with their sons. So there's definitely a gendered pattern in how parents talk to their kids about science, and that can definitely send a message about who science is for and who's good at it.
Right. And how does that affect girls' engagement with science? If they're getting these messages from their parents that, science isn't really for them or that they're not, naturally good at it, how does that impact their choices and their performance?
So the research suggests that girls actually rely more on parental support and feedback when it comes to science, especially in those, high school, college years when they're making decisions about what to study, what career paths to pursue. So parental encouragement, it can be a huge factor in whether females choose to major in, physics or engineering, for example. And on the flip side, parents might be more accepting of their daughters, kind of avoiding those more advanced physics classes, maybe because they see it as, a more masculine subject or just not as relevant to their daughter's future career goals. So it seems like females are just more influenced by those teacher and parent perceptions, and they might just need more explicit support and encouragement to really thrive in those STEM fields. And a lack of that support it can really hold them back. It can hinder their development of expertise.
Right? It's like they're getting these subtle messages from all sides, from society, from their teachers, from their parents about what's appropriate for them, what they're good at. And that can really limit their options and their sense of what's possible.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember that those messages, they often start really early on and they can be really subtle. So they can be hard to even recognize, let alone counteract.
Okay, so let's talk about motivation,
Yeah.
because that seems like a really key ingredient in this whole long journey of developing expertise, right? Like
Yeah.
you have to want it, you have to be driven, you have to put in the effort. So what do we know about gender differences in motivation when it comes to science and particularly physics?
Well, if you look at the general expertise research, it highlights over and over how important motivation is, right? You have to be motivated to engage in that sustained effort, to do that deliberate practice, to really push yourself to get better. And then, research on gender differences, that consistently shows that starting as early as middle school and going all the way through college, females just tend to have lower motivation when it comes to pursuing science courses and science careers, especially in physics. And this drop in interest, it seems to be like particularly steep for females during middle school, and they often report lower confidence in their scientific abilities compared to boys. And then, at the college level, low motivation in physics and engineering, it's been linked to poorer achievement. So it's really a crucial piece of the puzzle.
So the question is, what's driving this difference in motivation? What are the factors that are contributing to it?
Well, there are, a bunch of factors that seem to be at play here. One of the big ones is this perception of science and physics especially as being a masculine field. Like there's this stereotype that scientists are men, and that can definitely lower girls' motivation and their sense of belonging, right? If you don't see yourself represented in a field, it's harder to imagine yourself being successful in it. And then there's this phenomenon called stereotype threat, which is basically it's this fear of confirming a negative stereotype about about your group. So, for example, if you're a girl and you're aware of the stereotype that girls aren't good at physics, that awareness can actually make it harder for you to perform well because you're so worried about confirming that stereotype. And studies have actually shown that, like, when you make that stereotype salient, when you kind of bring it to the forefront of people's minds, it can actually negatively impact female performance in physics and engineering. So it's really powerful stuff.
Right, so it's like it's not just about ability, it's about how you feel about your ability and how you think other people perceive your ability. And the nature of science careers themselves might also be a factor, right? Like the types of jobs that are available, the kind of work that scientists do, that might be playing a role too.
Yeah, definitely. There's some evidence to suggest that females might be less motivated to pursue physical science careers like physics or engineering because those fields aren't always perceived as being people-oriented. Like they're seen as being more about working with, objects and equations and less about interacting with people and making a difference in their lives. And females, on average, they tend to express more interest in careers that are about helping people, about interacting with people, about making a positive impact on society. And that might explain why you see, more women going into fields like medicine compared to physics or engineering. So it's not just about the subject matter itself, it's about like the bigger picture, the values and the goals that people have.